Oh, what a gift to get to be with you all today. And I just want to say, especially as you all are headed into this season of transition for Kevin and Grace as well, I want to say to you, Kevin and Grace, I am so impressed with the faith that you've exerted in order to be a part of launching this beautiful community, the courage that you've had to be able to not only get this thing going, but for it to become what it is today, and this beautifully rich, diverse, really unique church. And so I'm so grateful for you. I'm grateful for your faithfulness. I'm grateful for the way that you have loved people well. And so, yeah, what a gift to get to just be here with you today. And so I'm just so proud of you and proud to get to be your friend. Now, I come to you from Long Beach, California, down the road a little bit. And like Kevin was saying, I was pastoring a church down there. I was part of that church for 19 years. And I actually started there 2 weeks after I got married. I got married while I was an undergrad in college, because if any of you went to a Christian college, that is what you do. It's ring by spring or your money back. And so we wanted to make sure, so we got married, started at this church, and because I was there for 19 years, they saw me change in so many ways. They saw me change in beliefs and grow in all of those kinds of ways, but they also saw me physically change. And you can't help when you're up in front of a group on a week in, week out basis to notice that physical change. And so at one point I had grown out this beard, and it wasn't like it is now. It was gnarly. It was big. It was tough. It was a good beard. I mean, it was so good that I was doing work with an organization that was at a distance, and they had asked me, can you send us a photo so that when our people are interacting with you, that they know who they're talking to? And I sent them a picture, and one of the guys on their team responded, and he said, he looks like he could chop down a tree just by staring at it. That's how good this beard was. So you need to know about the beard. The other thing that you need to know is that I can be incredibly awkward interpersonally. That if we talk one-on-one, that you'll be like, what is wrong with this guy? And that's what would happen at my church. People would see me preach, and they would think, I think we could be friends. I think Mike and I would like to hang out. And then we would talk after church, and they would walk away, and they'd be like, I don't think we can be friends. We cannot hang out. He's super awkward. But in the graciousness of people at my church, they were constantly looking for ways to connect with me, to figure out how do we connect with Mike, and just find some sort of way to talk, some sort of common ground. And so what they would often do is they would find some sort of thing that I was doing, some sort of thing that was changing about me, and use that as a point of talking. And so what they began to say as I grew out this big, gnarly, awesome beard was they began to ask me, Mike, what's it like to have a beard? Which is a weird question to ask. That was amazing. It's a weird question to ask, but it was them trying to figure out, how do we connect with awkward Mike? And so I began to have the same response that I would say every time. I'd say, oh, I had no idea how much maintenance was involved. A beard takes a lot of work, and I thought you grow out a beard because you stopped caring. But actually, when you grow out a beard, you have to care a lot more. There's lotions and waxes that you have to get. There's special wash for it, different combs. You have to do all kinds of work. And so I'd tell this to people every time they'd ask me, how's it been growing out a beard? But there was this one time after I had finished preaching where a couple who are a bit older than me came up. They're maybe about 30 years older than me or so. And they said the thing that everybody had been saying to try to figure out how to connect with awkward Mike. They said, Mike, what's it been like to grow out a beard? And I said a response that was slightly different than what I'd ever said before. I said, I never knew how much manscaping was involved. And this older woman, her eyes get real big, and she leans in and she goes, what did you say? And I said, yeah, I didn't know how much manscaping was involved. I have to manscape all the time now, and I didn't have to manscape before, but now I manscape all the time. And did you know that there are special manscaping products? And I have to spend all this money on special manscaping products? In fact, I had to manscape before I came to church today, and I'll have to manscape several times this week. And her eyes got even bigger. She leans in even closer, and she says, just above a whisper, because there's a lot of people around, she goes, Mike, I don't think that means what you think that it means. And I just kind of nervously laughed, and they walked away, and I pulled out my phone and I Googled manscaping. And it does not mean what I thought that it meant. And I don't recommend doing it because it will throw off your algorithms in some not good ways. But that phrase, I don't think that it means what you think that it means, that began to be a sort of like, for me, that phrase became a kind of like moniker, a kind of mantra that became helpful for me as my own faith began shifting and changing and evolving as I grew and matured, that I kept finding that I was coming to these places where there was a way that I thought faith worked, and it had worked for me before, but it was no longer working in that way. There were things that had made sense to me before, but they were no longer making sense, and I kept having these, I don't think that it means what you think that it means kind of moments. And then I came across this story. It's found in Mark chapter 8, a story of a healing that Jesus partakes in, that Jesus does. And it began for me to make some sense. It began for me to help to capture and make sense of what was going on in those moments where I'd have those, I don't think that it means what I thought that it meant moment. So it's in Mark chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 22. It'll be up there on the screens. Here's how Mark tells the story. He says that they, and they is talking about the disciples, those early first followers of Jesus, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, he led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus said, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and he said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." I see people. They look like trees walking around. So there's this blind man who's been brought to Jesus, and Jesus does this just strange act. He spits on the man's eyes, he puts his hands on him, and then the results of that are the only recorded instance that we have in the gospel accounts, is the only recorded instance that we have of Jesus going to heal somebody, and it doesn't fully take. It doesn't fully work. He can see, but he doesn't see clearly. I see people, but they look like trees walking around. Now, when you read scholars who are trying to sort this out and make sense of what's going on here, you are going to get a lot of different angles and a lot of different ideas. But one thing that you will consistently hear, at least from most of the scholars that I've engaged in on this, one thing you'll consistently hear is that Mark is using this as a sort of literary device in the way that he's writing his gospel account. That what happens is that this is this turning point in the story. It's a sort of hinge point. That there's what happens before this story in Mark 8, and there's what happens after this story in Mark 8. That this story, up until this point, the way that Jesus' disciples could be described is how Jesus would talk about them just like moments before this. It's just a few verses earlier in verse 18 that Jesus would say to his disciples, he would say, "Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear?" You have eyes, you have the ability to see, but you're not able to see fully. You have ears, you have the ability to hear, but you're not able to hear fully. You get it, but you actually don't fully get it. You see me, Jesus is saying, but you actually don't fully see me. You get what we are doing, but you actually don't fully get what we are doing. You hear about the kingdom, but you actually don't fully understand the kingdom. It's this way of saying you have some understanding, but I don't think it means what you think that it means. And the story of this man in Bethsaida serves as this sort of like transition point where the disciples are shifting from unseeing to seeing. And what I've discovered is that our own faith and our own progression of faith is a series of experiences like that, where you develop an understanding and then we're often dismantling that understanding. It's developing and it's dismantling, and then we're being confronted with what we have developed with new information. We'll have new experiences. We'll have new depth of insight. We will have new maturity, which then causes us to have this realization of, oh, I don't think that meant what I thought that it meant. It causes us to have this realization where we realize, oh, I've been able to see, but I actually haven't been seeing clearly. And my guess is that this is what many of us have maybe experienced. You've gone through a season where you thought you could see so clearly and well, and maybe your story is you'd been brought up in the church. And as a result of being brought up in the church, you had a certain lens and framework that had been handed down to you. And then maybe what happened for you is your story is that you went to college and your worldview was enlarged. And you thought you could see before, but now all of a sudden you're being confronted with new and different information. Or maybe what happened is that you got new and different information than you had before about the scriptures, about your sacred texts and the way that they have been put together. Or even what happened is that you begin to learn about and realize the ways that these sacred texts have been used to justify far too much evil and horrific violence at times. Maybe for you what happened is you had come to faith in a faith community that had a fairly narrow view of God and pretty strict and defined rules and boundaries as to what it meant to belong, to be a part of the community of God's people. And what began to happen is you started to meet good and beautiful people who didn't fit in those narrow definitions. You began to encounter other people who believed in that same God, but who would read and interpret those same texts differently. Have you ever had some of those kinds of experiences in your faith journey? Yeah, have you had those kinds of moments where it was like you're on a trajectory and something sort of hit in some sort of way? The way that faith had worked for you before was no longer working. The way that you had understood things of faith before no longer made sense. And you had that, I don't think it means what I thought that it meant moment. You had this realization that you'd been able to see, but you hadn't been seeing clearly. And the thing is that all of that, those sorts of experiences, all of that is completely normal. The problem is that we have made it abnormal. But you see this kind of journey throughout the church's history. You see this kind of journey and progression of faith all through like the writings of the ancient mystics. You find contemporary behavioral psychologists who have studied it and even have studied it throughout different kinds of faith communities. And we know that it's normal because so many of us have experienced it for ourselves, and we are in communities with people who have gone through these sorts of faith shifts. So the problem is not that it happens. The problem is that we treat it like it's abnormal, and then we give it labels to term that experience that make it like incredibly destructive. And so we call it things like this. Maybe you've heard this term used. We'll call it things like deconstruction. Has anybody ever heard that? Yeah, use that. And if that term works for you and makes sense of your journey, I think that's fantastic. And if you find it helpful, you should use it. I mean, I find myself using it more and more because it's become a sort of colloquial term that in sort of like Christian, like in like sort of Christian subculture, when we talk about it, people know what that means and have some immediate reactions to it. And so I find it helpful to use in that way. But I have also often wondered if it's a term that carries with it a more destructive connotation than it actually needs to. Because what we're describing is not something being destroyed. We're actually describing something that is a perfectly normal process of our faith journey. And because we haven't seen it as a perfectly normal process of our faith journey, one of the things that we have done is we will often look at where we came from. We will look at places that were a part of our faith journey early on, experiences that were earlier experiences of our faith journey, and people who are influential for our faith journey early on, for our formation early on. And sometimes we will look back at them and we will look at it with disdain. And I wonder if we could see it differently. I wonder if we could see it like that it's actually a part of our development and it's a part of our journey and maybe even a necessary part of our development and journey. I wonder if we could see it like this first experience that this man in Bethsaida has, that he has been touched by Jesus. He has had a real, actual encounter with Jesus, and he couldn't see before, and now he can see. It's more than he had before, but he doesn't see clearly. So it's had this real encounter, this real healing. He's not where he needs to be yet, but that doesn't dismiss what is actually happening in that moment. And the thing is that for us in our faith journeys, we no longer need where we once were, but maybe we needed those things. Maybe we needed those experiences, those people, and those places. Maybe we needed it at that time and at that place, and we wouldn't be where we're at today without those things. Because sometimes the place where it starts is in the same place where it started for this man in Bethsaida. It starts with being able to see, but not actually seeing clearly. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that happens in those earlier times are good, right? That maybe for some, that you have had earlier experiences in church and in faith communities that were actually harmful and destructive and that caused trauma and pain. And it's not to excuse those things and to somehow like put a smile on it and pretend like those were actually good. But I wonder if we also do recognize that there are parts of that experience that did set us up for where we are now. Not of the trauma and pain that didn't need to happen, But of those earlier communities, I wonder if there are parts of it that I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't have the faith I have today. I wouldn't have the understanding I have today. I wouldn't be doing the things I'm doing today without those earlier experiences. And so sometimes when I'm working with people who are going through this journey and they're trying to make sense of that faith journey they're going on, I'll use a metaphor like this to try to make sense of it. And I think that this is incomplete, but I think it's a bit helpful. I'll say, like, imagine that we're trying to teach a kid how to cross the street. And imagine that that kid is really little, and because of how old they are and because of the developmental stage where they're at, what we'll tell that kid is we'll say, you are never allowed to cross the street. Because that makes sense for where they're at, for what they need at that stage developmentally. Maybe a little bit later, what we'll tell them is, you are allowed to cross the street, but only when you hold an adult's hand. At all other times, you are not allowed to cross the street, only when you hold an adult's hand. Then maybe they grow up a little bit more and they're ready for a little bit more. And so then what we say is, you can cross the street, but only in this particular location, only when you look both ways, only when there are no other cars on the street whatsoever. I don't care how far away they are, you can cross at those times. We'll tell that, and we'll use these absolutist statements along the way, won't we? That here's when you can do it, here's when you can't do it. Here's when it's okay, here's when it's not okay. Here's when it's right, here's when it's wrong. And here's what happens is our absolutist language actually changes a bit over time, doesn't it? That as they grow and mature, they can handle something different, and so what they can handle expands, and it gets a little bit bigger. And then finally what happens is we get to a point where we are like grown adults, and nobody has to tell us when we can cross the street or not. Like, we'll make decisions on our own. And my guess is that for most of us, when we walk out of here and we'll cross the street, we are not making conscious decisions about it, but instead what's happened is all of that earlier stuff has been ingrained in us. It created a foundation for us, and it's been internalized. And so we will subconsciously then make good decisions about safely crossing the street because of all of that, without those absolutist sort of boundaries anymore. Because that's what it means to be an adult, that you've sort of grown up. It's a normal developmental thing. We use wisdom and discernment and judgment without those sorts of boundaries. What you could do, though, is you could become an adult and you could look back at those earlier times and you could say, I was lied to. I was told I could never cross the street, and I can cross the street. I was told that I always had to hold an adult's hand, and I don't have to hold an adult's hand. I don't need that. And we could look back, and we could look back with disdain. And we could look back and we could say, the people who told me that, they lied to me. The people who told me that, like, we could do all of that, but what we wouldn't realize is that we needed all of that to get where we are. And of course you've outgrown it, because that's what we do when there's a proper foundation set. You were never meant to stay at that stage. You were never meant to stay at that place. And maybe that's one of the things that's damaging us in the church today, is that the church at large, not this church, because I know this church isn't like this, but the church at large is trying to often get us to stay stuck in a stage that says you always need an adult to hold your hand. And it doesn't create the room and the capacity for you to grow and to mature and to become that adult yourself. Of course you should grow past those stages, but of course you also needed those stages. And so sometimes our reality is, sometimes first we have to see, but not clearly, before we're able to see more clearly. Which is what we see happening with this encounter with this man has with Jesus. Here's how it goes on in verse 25. Mark writes this. He says, once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Now, I love the way that one scholar, Sarah Rudin, translates this, that she identifies her faith with the Quaker stream of the Christian tradition, and she's a translator of ancient literature and recently translated the gospel accounts in ways that for me have been like some fresh takes on it. And here's how she translates it. She says, he saw with his eyes wide open, he saw everything clearly and in focus. He got to this point where he could now see clearly and in focus. Mark is using this story in his gospel as a way of showing how the disciples used to see Jesus, but they didn't see him clearly. And then they go through a shift where they begin to see him more clearly, more in focus, with their eyes wide open. Mark is also describing the journey of faith that you and I will go on. We'll spend a lot of time walking around where we can see, but not clearly. And then something will happen and some sort of shift will take place and we'll have our eyes opened a bit more. And we'll begin down some new paths where we start to see more clearly and more in focus. And what I've come to realize is that this is actually a cycle that we'll continually go through, where we will see, we'll come to a realization that we weren't seeing clearly. Our eyes will be open, we'll see more clearly and more in focus until we get to another point where something comes into our path and we realize, oh, I hadn't been seeing as clearly as I thought that I would. And when we continually are going through this, our eyes keep being open and keep being opened. And woe to us if we ever think we've arrived. Woe to us if we ever think that we are the ones who can finally see clearly. Instead, we're the people who regularly live in this cycle. It reminds me a little bit of a friend of mine who's teaching me to draw. It's my friend Rogelio. This is a picture of Rogelio teaching me to draw that we conveniently posed for Instagram. I'd always wanted to be able to draw like the things that I could see, that I wanted to be able to sketch them, and my sketches never looked like what the thing actually was. And so Rogelio's a gifted artist, and he would come over to my house once a week to teach me to draw. And the first thing that he would have me do every time we got together is he said, I want you to look at that object, whatever it was that we were going to draw. And he said, I want you to put your pencil on the paper and trace the object with your eyes. Don't look down at the paper, and let your pencil follow the object as your eyes trace it. And every time we would do this, and every time I would create something that I was like, Rogelio, this is not getting me better. This looks worse because I'm drawing something without looking at the paper. I'm looking at the thing. And so I finally asked him, why are we doing this? And he said, Mike, the reason that we're doing this is because your brain creates shortcuts. Your brain has to conserve energy, and it's got to have shortcuts for things. And so when you look at somebody's nose, what you will naturally draw is not that person's nose. It's the shortcut that you've created in your mind of what a nose is like. When you see a tree, what you're going to draw is not that tree that's actually there in front of you, not that clear tree in front of you, but instead you're going to draw the shortcut that your mind has already decided this is what a tree is like. And he said, so what you have to do is you have to intentionally unlearn those shortcuts in order to see the thing that's in front of you for what it actually is. That if you want to see clearly, you have to do that. And so we would do this practice every week as a way of retraining my brain, not to default to the thing, the shortcut that was in there, but to instead try to see the thing for what it actually is. I've become convinced that this is a part of how our faith operates as well. We've got a lot of default things that we've inherited over the years, a lot of default things that have just created shortcuts for us, and we will look at faith, we'll look at other people, we will look at all sorts of expressions of faith, we will look at our understanding of the scriptures and all these things, and we have natural defaults that are not bad, but they're natural defaults that we've inherited over the years. And it requires a intentional and constant reframing to say, I want to see that thing for what it actually is. And so here's what I want to do to close out my time with you, is to just teach you a simple prayer that I use in those sorts of situations. And maybe it could be helpful for you as well. It's a way of praying that's called a breath prayer. A breath prayer is a kind of prayer that's been practiced for hundreds of years in the church. It's simple phrases where you say a simple phrase as you breathe in and a simple phrase as you breathe out. And the one I want to teach you today is just simply this, is to say, as you breathe in, God help me. As you breathe out, to see clearly. And so I want to ask you if you wouldn't mind getting comfortable in your chair and closing your eyes and practicing this prayer with me. Just breathe in. God help me. Breathe out. See clearly. Breathe in. God help me. Breathe out. See clearly. When you have that moment where it feels like your faith is feeling a little bit shaky because something that you'd understood before is being questioned. You have new information, new understanding, new experiences. When you have that and you're not sure what to do, you simply breathe in, God help me. Breathe out, see clearly. You breathe in, God help me. And you breathe out, see clearly. When you're having that meal with friends or family who are in a different place than you, who maybe were a part of some of those former experiences, maybe they don't quite see things the way that you do, and what they want to do is they want to use these meals, Thanksgiving, family gatherings, sitting around a table, whatever it is, to sort of chide you and go after kind of where you're at with your faith. When you're having those moments as you sit at that table, you just breathe in. God, help me. Breathe out. See clearly. God, help me. See clearly. When you have that moment where maybe you feel a little bit embarrassed because of what you had held so tightly onto, and so it's hard to admit publicly that, like, I'm not holding on to that in that same sort of way, and you're not sure what to do, you breathe in. God, help me. Breathe out. See clearly. When you come across that person that your natural shortcut in your brain is to think certain kinds of things about them, to have certain kind of categories for them, what you do is you stop yourself and you breathe in. God, help me. Breathe out. See clearly. God, help me. See clearly. God, help me. See clearly.